Welcome to Late Night Calm. Imagine for a moment that you reach for a length of cloth. Soft cotton, cool against the skin on a warm afternoon. You drape it over your shoulders and you step out into the street. And for that single, simple act, you could be put to death. That is not a story. That is the law. In the city we are about to walk into together, the cloth on your back was not a matter of taste or comfort or even of wealth. It was your legal identity woven into every thread, and to wear the wrong fiber was to commit a crime that the state could answer with your life. If you were a common person, an ordinary farmer or fisher or laborer, the cotton was forbidden to you. Forbidden by name, by statute, by the will of the men who governed every layer of this world. You wore maguey instead. You wore the coarse, scratching thread spun from the agave plant, the cloth they called ixtal, the fabric of the many, and the soft cotton, the bright feathers, the gold, the deep dyes that bloomed like sunset. Those were held back by law for the few above you. Reach above your station, clothe yourself in the colors of your betters, and the punishment could be death. So let us settle in. Let the day you have just lived begin to loosen its grip. Wherever you are tonight, whatever room holds you, whatever weather presses at the window, let it all soften at the edges. And before we descend, I would love to know quietly where in the world you are listening from. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it, a single word, the name of your town, your country, the place where the dark has come to find you. And if you are new here, if this slow voice in the night is something you would like to return to, you might think about subscribing so the next long story can find its way to you. Because tonight, we are going somewhere old, somewhere built on water and stone, a city of perhaps 250,000 souls, larger than any city in Spain at the very same hour, floating in the middle of a lake on a tangle of engineered islands. We are going into the Aztec Empire, into the world of the Mexica, and we are going to do something that most stories about this place never bother to do. We are not going to stand at the top of a pyramid and watch the spectacle. We are going to live there. We are going to ask the only question that really matters when you imagine yourself into another world. What would my life have actually been like? Not the kings, not the battles, not the famous ending. Your life. Your clothes, your supper, your debts, the things that could get you killed, and the one slender hope you might have had of climbing higher than the rung you were born on. And here is the thread I want you to hold as you drift, the single idea that ties every level of this world together, top to bottom, dirt floor to golden throne. Everyone in this empire owed something. Everyone was paying. The farmer owed his tribute and his labor. The merchant owed his secrets to the crown. The warrior owed captives. The noble owed the work of governing. And at the very summit, the man no one in the entire empire was permitted to look upon, the God King himself, owed a debt so heavy it bent the whole society into the shape it had. He owed blood. He owed it to the gods to keep the sun moving across the sky. No one here was free. Not the slave, not the emperor. They were all, every one of them, paying off a debt they had not chosen and could never finish paying. That is the secret of this place. Not the violence, the obligation. And we are going to follow that chain of debt all the way up, link by link, from the bottom. So let us begin where almost everyone began, at the bottom, with the farmer. If you had lived in this empire, the overwhelming odds are that you would have been a Mashahuali. That was the word for the common, free person, the ordinary citizen. And in the plural, they were the Masahualtin, the great mass of the people who fed everyone else and built everything that stood. The word itself carried a quiet weight to it, a sense of the deserved one, the common person, the one who simply was the people. You would have been a farmer most likely, or a fisher pulling your living from the lake, or a laborer carrying loads that the empire needed moved. You were the foundation. Everything above you, every noble in his cotton, every priest at his altar, every line of tribute flowing into the capital rested its whole weight on the back of someone exactly like you. But you were not alone in it. You belonged to something. You belonged to a Kalpuli. Hold that word in your mind for a moment, because it is one of the keys to understanding your whole life. The Kalpuli was a kind of clan, a ward, a neighborhood, and a family, and a land holding all braided into one. The name meant, roughly, the big house, and that is a lovely way to picture it. Not a single building, but a great extended household of related families living near one another, sharing a patch of the world, holding land in common and working it together. You were born into your Kalpuli the way you were born into your own skin. It gave you your place. It gave you your land. And here is the part that shapes everything about the rhythm of your days. The land was not yours. Not yours alone, the way we might think of owning a field today, with a paper that says your name and the right to sell it to whoever you please. The land belonged to the Kalpuli, held collectively by the whole clan, and the clan allotted a plot to your family to work and to feed yourselves from. You had the use of it, you had the right to its harvest, but you could not simply sell it off, could not carve it away from the body of the clan and hand it to a stranger. The land was the clan's, lent to you for as long as you honored it. And there was a quiet, hard condition wrapped inside that arrangement, the kind of rule that tells you exactly what this society valued. You had to work the land. If you let your plot lie idle, if for 2 whole years you failed to plant it and tend it and bring it to harvest, you could lose it. The Kalpuli could take it back and give it to a family that would use it. Idleness was not a private failing here. It was a kind of theft from the whole, because in a city of 250,000 mouths balanced on the water, every untended field was a danger to everyone. So you worked. The seasons turned and you turned with them, and the obligation to the soil was the first link in the chain that ran all the way up to the gods. And what did all that work put on your table? Let us sit at that table for a while, because supper tells you more about a life than almost anything else. At the center of everything always was maize, corn. It was not simply a food here, it was the substance of life itself, the thing the gods were said to have made people from. You ate it as tortillas, flat and warm off the griddle, and you ate it as tamales, soft parcels of dough steamed in their husks. Around the maize sat the 2 faithful companions that grew beside it in the field, beans and squash, the 3 of them planted together so that one climbed, one sheltered, one fed the soil. And cutting through all of it, brightening every bite, the chili pepper, sharp and warming, present at nearly every meal. There was amaranth too, tiny grains gathered by the millions, and chia, those little seeds that swelled and steadied a body through a long day of labor. For something richer, for the days that mattered, there was meat. The great bird of this land was the turkey, raised in the yard, and from it came eggs and flesh both. And there were dogs, though not the dogs you might keep beside your fire for company. A particular breed, the Xoloitzcuintli, the hairless dog of this country, was raised for the pot, fattened and eaten the way another people might raise a pig. There was fish, of course, pulled fresh from the lake that cradled the whole city. And then there were the foods that came straight off the surface of the water, foods that would astonish a visitor from across the sea, foods that the lake itself seemed to offer up. Picture the shallows on a still morning. On the surface of the water lived small insects, the water boatmen, and they laid their eggs in vast pale clouds among the reeds. Those eggs were gathered, dried, and eaten, and they had a name that survives to this day, ahuautl, sometimes called the Mexican caviar, a delicacy skimmed from the skin of a lake. And there was more. On certain stretches of the water grew a blue-green bloom, an algae the people called tequitlatl, and they harvested it, this living scum of the lake, and pressed it and dried it into firm dark cakes that could be eaten like a kind of cheese. It was rich in the things a body needs, and it cost almost nothing but the labor of skimming it off the surface. A whole city, fed in part by what floated. And here is something I want you to hold on to, a small piece of quiet genius hidden inside that humble bowl of maize. The corn was not simply ground and cooked. First, it was soaked and simmered in water mixed with lime, with cal, an alkaline solution that softened the kernels and slipped their skins. The people called this process, in their language, what we now call nixtamalization. It was the ordinary, daily, unthinking work of every household, a step so old and so habitual that no one questioned it. But that single step, that soak in lime water, did something extraordinary that no one in that kitchen could have explained. It unlocked the nourishment inside the corn, freed up a vitamin, the one we call niacin, that the body could not otherwise reach. Without it, a people who lived almost entirely on maize would have sickened with the wasting disease that strikes those who eat corn, and nothing more. With it, they thrived. They had stumbled over countless generations onto a chemistry they did not know was chemistry. They simply knew that this was how you treated the corn, because this was how it had always been done, because the grandmothers did it, because it made the dough come together right. Tradition, quietly carrying a truth the people never had to name. A whole civilization kept healthy by a habit. Now lift your eyes from the table and look at the room around you, because this is your home, and it is humble. You would not be living in a palace, nor in any kind of grandeur. A common family lived most often in a single room, a modest house built of adobe, of sun-dried mud brick, or else of wattle and daub, woven sticks packed with mud and lime raised up under a roof of thatch. One room for the living and the cooking and the sleeping of a whole family. Simple, close, warm with bodies in the cool of the night. But beside that single plain room, very often, stood something that might surprise you, something that tells you these were not a people indifferent to comfort or to cleanliness. A small separate structure, a low dome of stone and earth, the temazcal. The sweat bath. You would heat its stones until they glowed, and crawl inside into the close dark, and pour water over the hot rock until the little chamber filled with steam, and there you would sit and sweat and let the heat draw the weariness out of your muscles and the dirt from your skin. It was for cleansing the body, yes, but it was for more than that. It was for healing, for easing aches, for the recovery of women after childbirth, for a kind of ritual purification of the spirit as much as the flesh. Imagine it. A poor family, dirt floor, single room, coarse maguey cloth on their backs, and yet, at the end of a long day in the fields, they could step into their own little chamber of steam and emerge clean and loosened and renewed. There is a tenderness in that. A people who, even at the bottom of the pyramid, knew how to care for the tired body. And now I want to tell you the thing about this common life that most surprises people, the thing that quietly overturns whatever picture you might have carried in. These were not an ignorant people, kept in the dark and worked like animals. Your children, the children of a farmer, of a fisher, of a laborer, went to school. Every child. Let that sit with you for a moment because of how rare it was anywhere on Earth at that time. In a world where, across the ocean in Europe, schooling was the privilege of a tiny, lettered few, this empire sent its children, common and noble alike, boys and girls both, to be taught. Education was not a luxury hoarded by the powerful. It was an obligation owed to every young life, woven right into the structure of the Kalpuli. For the common boys, there was a school called the Telpochkali, the House of Youth. There they were trained in the things a man of the people would need, the handling of weapons and the discipline of war, because every commoner might be called to fight. The history of their people, the deeds of their ancestors, the songs and the proper conduct of a citizen, the duties they owed to their ward and their gods, hard labor, public works, the carrying and the building that kept the city standing. They learned to be useful, to be brave, to take their place in the great machine. And then there was the other school, the higher one, the Karmakak. This was the school of the nobility, stern and demanding, where the sons of the great families were prepared for the priesthood and for high office, steeped in the calendar and the rituals and the deep knowledge that ran the cosmos. It was a place of severe discipline, of fasting and of penance, and of learning so weighty that it set a boy apart for life. And here is the small door left open in the wall, the first hint of a truth we will keep meeting on this journey. The Karmakak was not absolutely closed to the common born. A gifted child of the people, marked out as exceptional, could sometimes be admitted to that elite school, lifted toward the priesthood and the higher path. Even at this very first rung, the system had cracks in it, little openings through which a remarkable life might climb. Hold that thought. We will see those openings grow wider as we rise. So picture your day now, the whole shape of a common life. You wake in your single adobe room. You pull on a garment of rough maguey fiber because the soft cotton is forbidden you on pain of death. You eat your maize, treated with lime by hands that never knew why, perhaps with beans and chili, perhaps with a little turkey or a portion of dried algae cake skimmed from the lake. You go out to the plot your Kalpuli has lent you, and you work it, because to leave it idle 2 years running is to lose it. Your children walk to the Telpochkali or the Kalmakak to be taught the history and the duty of their people. And in the cool of the evening, you might heat the stones of your little sweat bath and let the day's labor steam away in the dark. It is a small life, a hard life in its way, but it is not a chaotic one and it is not an ignorant one. It is ordered, schooled, fed and clean, governed at every turn by law and by obligation. And it is the foundation. Everything we are going to see, every level we are going to climb, rests on the back of this ordinary person, on the work of these careful hands. But before we leave the Makahwali behind and begin our climb, I want to plant a few seeds with you, a few small mysteries that we will return to as the night goes on, loops that will close themselves much later, further up the pyramid. The first, we said that the soft cotton was forbidden to a common person, reserved by law for those above. And yet there was a way, a single hard and bloody way, for a farmer's son to earn the right to wear that forbidden cloth, to rise out of the common mass and put on the colors of his betters. We will reach it when we climb to the level of the warrior, and you will see exactly what a man had to do, and how many of his enemies he had to drag home, to clothe himself in cotton and call himself something more than a commoner. The second, we have talked about working the land and skimming the lake for food, but there was money in this world, real money that changed hands in the great markets. And it was a kind of money that, in a manner of speaking, grew on trees. And because it grew on trees, because it could be gathered, there were people clever enough and dishonest enough to counterfeit it, to fake it, the same way a forger might pass false coins today. We will see how, and you will not believe what they filled the fakes with. The third. We have spoken of the man at the very top as someone no one was permitted even to look at. There was such a man, a living person somewhere in this city tonight, whom no subject could gaze upon directly, who had to be approached barefoot and with eyes lowered to the ground. By the end of our journey, you will understand who he was and how he lived, and most strangely of all, why even he, the God King at the summit of everything, was not a free man either, but the most indebted person in the entire empire. And the fourth, the one I find the most quietly astonishing of all, a person could be a slave in this empire, owned, bonded, sold, and yet that same person could on a single afternoon walk free, become a free citizen again in the space of a few minutes, if only they could reach the right doorway before the right hand caught them. There was a custom, strange and specific, that made it possible. We will come to it very soon at the next rung down, and you will see how a life could turn on a single sprint through a crowd. Hold those 4 loose threads in your sleepy mind: the cotton earned in blood, the money that grew on trees, the man no one could look at, the slave freed in an afternoon. We will tie each of them off before the night is done. For now, though, let us stay a moment longer in the world of the common person, and let me draw the city itself around you so you can feel the place this farmer lived, because the setting is half the wonder. You did not live in some scattered village in the wilderness. You lived in one of the great cities of the entire world, a place that an arriving stranger from across the ocean would later struggle even to describe, because nothing in his own country had prepared him for it. The capital sat in the middle of a lake, a city of stone and canal raised on the water itself, joined to the shore by long causeways, fed by fresh, sweet water carried in along aqueducts from the springs of Chapultepec, because the lake water all around was brackish and would not do for drinking. And the food that fed those 250,000 people, where do you think so much of it came from? From the water, from an invention so elegant it still astonishes the engineers who study it. They built fields on the lake, the chinampas. Picture it slowly. In the shallow water they would stake out a rectangle, and into that frame they would pile up the rich black mud dredged from the lake bottom, layer upon layer, building the soil up out of the water until it stood just above the surface. And to hold this new little island in place, to keep it from dissolving back into the lake, they planted willows along its edges, and the willow roots reached down and gripped the lake floor and laced the whole thing together, anchoring the field, fixing it, making solid ground out of mud and water and patience. And those engineered island gardens, those floating fields, were astonishingly fertile, watered from below by the lake itself, never thirsting, producing harvest after harvest, several crops a year, again and again. A city of 200,000 and more, fed by gardens that floated. There was no postcard prettiness to it, no idle decoration. It was engineering. It was a solution to the oldest problem there is, how to feed everyone, solved with mud and willow and the steady work of common hands. And the cleanliness of the place, I have to tell you about that, because it overturns every lazy assumption a stranger might carry in. This was not a filthy city. It may have been one of the cleanest large cities on earth at that hour. There were public latrines for the people to use. Human waste was not simply let run into the streets and the water the way it ran in the great cities across the sea. It was collected, carried away in canoes, ferried out of the city and sold. Sold because it had value as fertilizer for the fields and for the tanning of hides. Nothing wasted. The streets themselves were swept and watered and kept. By some accounts, 1,000 men were given over to the daily labor of cleaning and washing the streets of the capital day after day, so that this enormous floating city stayed ordered and fresh in a way that left every visitor groping for words. Picture walking those swept streets in the cool of a morning, the fresh water running clean in its channels from the distant springs, the canoes gliding along the canals, the chinampa fields green on the water at the city's edge. A common person, a Makehwali, lived inside that, walked those streets, drank that clean water. There is a dignity to this ordinary life that the old saturated stories of blood and conquest never let you see. And the order of it ran right down into the smallest corners of daily life, into things you would never expect a law to touch. There was drink in this world, a mild alcohol made from the sap of the maguey, the same plant that gave the poor their cloth. They fermented its sweet juice into a drink called pulque, octli, milky, and a little sour and gently intoxicating. But you could not simply drink it freely if you were a young commoner. Drunkenness was governed like everything else. Public drunkenness was watched and punished, and the right to drink your fill was largely reserved for the old, for those who had passed the age of around 52, who had lived what they thought of as a completed bundle of years, a full measure of life, and had earned at last the right to sit back and drink in peace. A young man caught drunk in the street faced real punishment, so even the cup in your hand was a matter of law, of age, of your standing in the order of things. Even pleasure was rationed by obligation. This was the world of the common person then, schooled, fed from field and lake, housed in a single clean room with a bath of steam beside it, clothed by law in coarse maguey, the cotton kept just out of reach, bound to the land of the clan, owing labour and tribute, free in 100 small ways and unfree in 100 others, the wide, deep, patient base of a pyramid that rose, level by level, into worlds of ever greater wealth and ever greater danger and ever greater debt. And just one rung down, just below even the common farmer, in the shadow of all this order, there were people who did not own their own labour at all, people who had sold themselves or been sold or fallen into bondage through debt and misfortune and the spin of a gambling game gone wrong, the bonded ones. And it is to them, and to that single strange afternoon on which one of them might run through a crowd toward freedom, that we will turn next. And so we descend, as the pyramid insists, one level at a time. The word the Mexica used was tlacotin. It named a state of bonded servitude, and it is important to hold that word with some care, because what it described was not what the word slave has come to mean to us across the centuries. When you hear slave, you may hear the Atlantic trade, that vast, brutal machinery of inherited and heritable suffering in which a person's unfreedom passed from parent to child like a blood condition, in which no contract existed, no term, no legal personhood at all. The tlacotin was something else, not gentle. Life at this level was not gentle, but structured in a way that differs enough from that other history to require a pause and a careful look before we go further. A tlacotin was a person in a contractual condition, a person who had, for one reason or another, exchanged their labor and their personal autonomy for something they needed more urgently at that moment. A debt settled, a famine survived, a punishment absorbed. The status was not branded into the blood. A tlacotin's children were born free. That was the law, and it held. Whatever weight had fallen on the parent did not transmit itself to the child at birth. The child entered the world as a free person, belonging to no one, unencumbered. This single fact sets the tlacotin sharply apart from what later centuries would build in the Americas, and it is worth letting that distinction breathe for a moment before moving on. There were several roads that led to this condition. The most dramatic, perhaps, was the road a person chose for themselves. A person in desperate circumstances, buried in debt they could not clear, watching a famine thin their household, facing a future that offered nothing stable, could sell themselves. The transaction was formal. It involved payment delivered up front, right at the moment of the agreement. And then, for a time, remarkably, the newly bonded person often returned home and continued living their ordinary life, working their usual days, until the household that had purchased their service called them in to begin work. This was not the sudden uprooting we might imagine. There was lag, deliberateness, a space between the agreement and its enactment. Others were sold by their families. Famine years could drive this. A household unable to feed everyone might negotiate the sale of a family member into bondage as the only way to ensure that someone, at least, survived and was fed. The logic was brutal in the way that survival logic always is, but it was logic nonetheless. And there were also those who arrived at tlacotin status through the courts, as a consequence of certain crimes, as a punishment handed down for debts unpaid across too many seasons without remedy. Captive enemies from war could become tlacotin as well, though their path through the system was often shorter and more violent, since captured warriors were more typically destined for the temples than for the households. The kind of tlacotin we are describing here, the domestic and contractual kind, was a Mexica citizen, a person embedded in the same social fabric as everyone around them, simply occupying one of its lower, harder folds. And the life of the tlacotin was not without texture. Bonded people could own property. They could accumulate possessions. They could marry, and they could marry free people, which is a detail that tells you something important about how porous this boundary was in daily life. A tlacotin man might have a free wife. A tlacotin woman might have a free husband. The children of such unions were free. And a tlacotin who managed to accumulate enough goods, enough cacao beans, enough of the cotton cloaks that served as currency, could simply purchase their own freedom, paying back what had been paid for them and stepping out of the condition entirely. This happened. It was not common, but it was legally available and documented. There was even one more extraordinary avenue, one that sounds, from this distance, almost like a scene from a story someone invented to make a point about the nature of obligation and freedom. But it was real, and it was documented, and it is this. If a bonded person managed to escape from their master's house and make their way through the city to the royal palace, to reach that threshold before being recaptured, they could claim their freedom. The law governing this moment was specific and strange in its precision. Only the master himself or the master's own son could lawfully stop the fleeing tlacotin and bring them back. No one else, not a neighbor, not a bystander, not a constable on the street, not even a member of the master's extended household. If anyone other than those two reached out and physically restrained the running person, it was that interfering stranger who became the offender, who bore the legal weight of the act. And so you can imagine the scene, a bonded person moving through a crowded street or marketplace, perhaps breathing hard, perhaps trying to appear unhurried, while the crowd around them was legally prohibited from stopping them, and only one or two people in the entire city had the authority to reach out and close that door to freedom. Make it to the palace. That was the distance between bondage and liberty. There is one other detail from this chapter that insists on being told because it illuminates the way ordinary daily life could fall apart so quietly and completely. The game of Patoli was a dice-like game played on a cross-shaped board, marked with a pattern of stones or beans as tokens, and it was widely played and deeply enjoyed. There was also the ball game, the great Mesoamerican tradition of a rubber ball struck with hips and forearms through stone rings, wagered on by crowds and players alike. And gambling on these games could ruin a man, quickly, thoroughly. A person who began with goods and comfort and lost and kept playing and lost again and kept playing past the point where sense would have stopped them could end an afternoon without a home and without their freedom. Chronic, serious gamblers were known to wager their own person, do their own future labor, as the last chip on the board. And so a man could walk into a game in the morning as a free person and walk out of it by evening as a tlacotin. Even freedom was something you could place on the mat and lose. This is the obligation machine at its most personal, most intimate scale, not the grand debt of the farmer to the empire, not the blood debt of the emperor to the son, but the private, quiet, devastating debt of one person to another, settled with the only currency they had left, the remaining years of their life. Now lift your eyes. Move horizontally across the city into a different kind of life, a life that appears at first glance to belong to a completely different world from the bonded ones and the common farmers, a life of travel, of foreign cities, of silk-wrapped secrets and intelligence carried home like contraband, a life of extraordinary wealth held beneath a deliberately ordinary surface. This is the life of the Pochteca. The Pochteca were merchants, but the word merchant does not carry enough weight on its own. Think instead of something between a guild, a spy network, a hereditary brotherhood, and a diplomatic corps. The Pochteca were long-distance traders, hereditary members of a closed professional class that moved in organized caravans out of the capital and into the far reaches of Mesoamerica, trading luxury goods, gathering tribute items, and doing something else as well, something that only became fully visible on the way home. They were the empire's eyes and ears in foreign lands. They were organized with the precision that the Mexica brought to nearly everything. The Pochteca lived not scattered through the city, but concentrated in their own wards, their own neighborhoods, alongside families who had done this same work for generations. The trade was hereditary, passed from parent to child the way a farmer passed the use of Kalpuli land, the way a noble passed title and privilege. A son born into a Pochteca household was born into a profession, a set of obligations, a network of connections, and a set of skills that took years to acquire and were not shared outside the guild. Their patron deity was Yakatecutli, whose name translates roughly as Lord of the Vanguard, the Lord of the Nose, the one who goes ahead, who leads the way, who sniffs out the road. There is something telling in that name. The merchant who led the caravan into unknown territory was exactly this. The nose of the empire, the advanced intelligence, the first presence in a place the armies had not yet reached. The Pochteca operated ahead of everything else, and Yakatecutli watched over the forward journey, the long road, the thin space between known and unknown. The Pochteca had their own courts, their own internal hierarchy with its own titles and its own gradations of status, their own festivals. If a dispute arose among merchants or between a merchant and a customer in the wider market, the Pochteca's internal court could handle it. This was not the empire's court sitting over them. It was their own, a guild jurisdiction embedded within the larger legal system, a domain of authority they had negotiated and maintained across generations. Now for the part that makes the Pochteca something more than merchants. When a caravan of Pochteca traders entered a foreign territory, a region not yet under Aztec control, a city-state that owed no tribute, a market in a rival empire's orbit, some of them were not merely selling and buying, some were listening, watching, counting, noting the walls of a city, the state of its granaries, the number of fighting men visible in the streets, the mood of the local ruler, the goods flowing through the local market, the weaknesses and the strengths of a place the Triple Alliance might one day decide to bring under its grip. These were the Noalostomika, the disguised merchants, whose very name encodes the subterfuge, Nawalo, hidden, disguised, Ostomika, merchants. They shed their Mexica dress and adopted the clothing, the hairstyle, the language of the region they moved through. They became, in appearance, local. They traded, they conversed, they lingered, and then they made the long journey home, carrying, alongside whatever goods they had acquired, a detailed picture of a territory that would prove useful to someone with armies. The information they carried was not casual gossip, it was strategic. Where were the road choke points? How well provisioned was the city? How loyal were the local rulers to their own alliances? The Pochteca delivered this to the state, and the state used it. Not every campaign against a distant city-state was preceded by this kind of mercantile reconnaissance, but many were, and the Pochteca were understood by both sides to be more than what they appeared. Foreign powers knew this too at some level, which is why the murder of a Pochteca traveling in foreign lands was not treated the way the murder of an ordinary traveler might be. It was treated as an act of aggression against the empire itself. This was codified. The killing of a Pochteca merchant in a foreign market was a legitimate casus belli, a legal and acceptable reason to mobilize armies and bring a military campaign against the offending region. The merchant's body, if it could not be recovered, was nonetheless the spark that lit the fire. Trade and war were inseparable in this empire, and the Pochteca were the thread connecting them. There is a quality to the Pochteca life that may seem surprising given all of this, given the wealth, the status, the extraordinary function they served. And that quality is deliberate, self-imposed, persistent humility. Not the internal humility of a person who genuinely thinks little of themselves, but the performed, strategic humility of a person who knows exactly how dangerous visible success is. The Pochteca were, by the standards of their world, extremely wealthy. They dealt in luxury goods, quetzal feathers, jade, obsidian, fine cloaks, exotic animals, cacao in enormous quantities, gold. They traveled farther and saw more of the world than almost anyone else in the empire. And they knew, because they understood the social order they inhabited, that displaying this wealth openly was a form of provocation. The Pipiltin, the hereditary noble class, watched the Pochteca with the particular resentment of an elite that has not earned a thing, watching another group grow rich through effort rather than blood. To a noble whose status was inherited, the successful merchant was a kind of affront to the theory of how the world was supposed to be arranged. And in a society where the people above you could, with the right provocation and the right pretext, destroy you, flaunting wealth above your station was not a social error. It was a survival error. And so the Pochteca returned from their long journeys at night. Not during the day, when their caravans and their cargo would be visible to the whole city, when curious eyes and jealous eyes would count the bales and add up the cacao beans and arrive at conclusions that might grow dangerous. They came in through the dark hours, quietly, their goods wrapped and bundled, and moved without ceremony into storage. They dressed plainly in public, in garments that gave no indication of what their storerooms held. They did not display their gold, did not drape themselves in cotton finer than their station nominally permitted, did not host lavish dinner parties where the food and drink would announce what they had become, except when they did, because there were specific ritual occasions, the great feasts connected to their patron deity, and the ceremonial calendar, when a wealthy Pochteca could and did display their wealth, and when that display was not only socially acceptable, but socially required. A merchant of sufficient standing might sponsor a lavish feast, feeding guests on a scale that would have embarrassed a middling noble, and the crowning act of such a feast might be the sacrifice of a purchased slave, a tlacotin acquired specifically for this purpose, dressed and adorned for the occasion, whose death was simultaneously an offering to the gods, a display of wealth, and an act of piety that elevated the merchant's standing in his guild and in the city. On those days, the mask of humility came off and the wealth was visible. On those days you saw what the nighttime caravans had been carrying. And then the feast ended, and the mask went back on, and the merchant returned to his plain clothes and his quiet streets, accumulating quietly, surviving quietly, in the peculiar discipline of the hidden rich. Consider what it meant to live this way, to know every morning that you were wealthier than many of the nobles who looked down at you, and to know that your survival depended on your ability to pretend otherwise for every moment of every ordinary day. To return from months on the road, carrying the intelligence of foreign cities and the treasures of distant markets, and to walk back into your ward under cover of darkness so no one would have occasion to notice how much you'd brought home. This was not poverty. It was its opposite, wearing poverty's clothing. And it too was a form of obligation. The obligation to be invisible, to keep the order undisturbed, to pay the social tribute of apparent smallness in exchange for the privilege of being left alone to grow. Now let us move again. Not down from the Pochteca, not up, but sideways, into another ward of the city, into another kind of hereditary skill held in family hands across generations. Into a world where the raw materials arriving through tribute and trade were transformed by extraordinary craft into the objects that clothed power and declared the beauty of the divine. These were the artisans, and in a city that prized skill and spoke of high craftsmanship with the word Toltecayotl, a word that reached back to the legendary Toltec civilization that preceded the Mexica, whose name had become synonymous with refinement, artistry, and everything civilized human hands could make. The skilled craftsperson occupied a place of genuine dignity in the world. Toltecayotl was not a word you used lightly. It meant the quality of Toltecness, the inheritance of that ancient standard, the claim that your work rose to the level of what the best makers of the past had achieved. To be called Toltec in this sense was to be confirmed as someone whose hands understood what most hands could not. Among all the artisan guilds, one stood at the very summit of prestige. They were the Amanteca, and they worked in feathers. The Amanteca lived and worked in their own ward within the city, a district called Amantla. Like the Pochteca, they were organized as a hereditary guild with their own patron deities, their own internal structure, their own ceremonies, their own way of transmitting the knowledge of the craft from one generation to the next. The trade was not taught to outsiders. It was held within the families of the ward, refined and protected, passed down through household instruction the way all the most precious knowledge in this city was passed, within a closed circle, from hands that knew to hands that would learn. What the Amanteca made was mosaic work in feathers, not embroidery, not simple dyeing, not weaving feathers into cloth, though all of those existed. This was something different and more demanding. The arrangement of feathers, cut and trimmed and selected by color and iridescence and the precise angle of the barb, laid down layer by layer onto a backing material, often a frame of dried plant pith or a cotton backing or a wooden form, to create images of extraordinary complexity and color, headdresses, shields, cloaks, fans. The images they worked in feather were the same images you saw in manuscripts and temple carvings: gods, warriors, eagles, serpents, solar symbols, the geometric patterns that meant rank and power and divine connection. But in feathers these images shimmered. They caught and shifted in the light in a way that no paint, no dye, no stone carving could replicate. The featherwork of the Amanteca was alive in a way that other luxury crafts were not. The most prized material they worked with was the plumage of the resplendent quetzal. Quetzal feathers, long, trailing, an almost impossible green that shifts toward blue and gold depending on the angle of light, were among the most valuable objects in the Mesoamerican world. They arrived in Tenochtitlan as tribute from distant lowland provinces where the Quetzal lived, because the bird did not inhabit the high lake valley of the capital. Each feather represented distance, difficulty, rarity. The Amanteca handled them with corresponding care. A single headdress might incorporate the work of many craftspeople across many months, and the finished object was not a decoration. It was a statement about the cosmos, about the identity of the person who wore it, about the connection between the human world and the divine one. Other materials the Amanteca worked with, the iridescent blue-green feathers of the cotinga, the brilliant yellow of the troupial, the deep red of the scarlet macaw, and many others drawn from the extraordinary avian richness of Mesoamerica, a diversity of birds that European observers found astonishing. The capital held an aviary in the palace complex, the emperor's own, that housed birds from across the empire's territory, partly for the pleasure of the court, and partly as a living treasury, a reservoir of feathers that fed the Amanteca's workshops. And then there were the other craft specialists, the metalworkers, whose mastery of goldsmithing produced work that European observers initially could not explain and could not fully replicate. The technique they used for the most complex pieces was lost wax casting, a process in which a model is made from beeswax in precise detail, surrounded by clay, fired so the wax melts and drains away, leaving a perfect negative space, and then filled with molten metal. The result is a casting that captures every fine detail the wax model held. A hummingbird in gold whose feathers are individually visible, a figure whose joints are articulated, an animal whose fur has texture. The Mexica goldworkers worked without iron tools, without the wheel, without many of the technical foundations European metalworkers had developed, and they produced objects that left European observers without words. The lapidaries, the workers in jade, turquoise, and obsidian, exercised a parallel mastery. Jade was the most sacred stone in Mesoamerican cosmology, more valued than gold in many contexts, associated with water, life, maize, and the breath of the divine. Turquoise arrived from far to the north and was worked into mosaic masks and shields and ritual objects that served the same function as the featherwork, making visible the divine power that the wearer or the object embodied. Obsidian, volcanic glass, found in quantity in the highlands, was worked into blades of a sharpness that modern materials science has confirmed exceeds the finest steel surgical scalpel in terms of cutting edge. Obsidian blades were used in surgery, in sacrifice, in the auto-sacrifice by which nobles and priests drew their own blood in ritual offering. They were also traded and gifted and worn as markers of wealth. All of this craft moved out of Tenochtitlan eventually to the wider world, and some of it moved very far. When Hernán Cortés assembled a collection of the most extraordinary objects from the Mexica treasury and sent them across the ocean to the court of Charles V in 1519 and 1520, the objects were seen not only by rulers and courtiers, but by the artists of Europe, who had no precedent for what they were looking at. Among those who saw the collection was Albrecht Dürer, the German artist and printmaker, who encountered the Mexica objects in Brussels in 1520. Dürer wrote in his diary that he had never seen anything in all his life that gladdened his heart so much as these things. He described the gold and silver objects with sustained awe, and he wrote that the ingenuity of the people from those faraway lands astonished him entirely. This was a man who had spent his life among the finest works of European craft, and who found, in the products of the Amanteca and the goldsmiths and the lapidaries of a city he would never visit, something that surpassed what he knew. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of this night, and letting that land. Dürer, who painted the hands of a praying man with the same precision the Amanteca brought to a single Quetzal feather. Dürer, sitting in Brussels in 1520, turning a Mexica goldwork object in his hands and writing that it gladdened his heart. Two traditions of extraordinary craft from opposite ends of the world, meeting briefly in a warehouse in the Low Countries, and one artist recognizing in the other's work the quality he had spent his life chasing. The objects are largely gone now, melted down for their gold, lost to time, surviving only in fragments and descriptions and a handful of museum pieces. But Dürer's words survive. They are still there, in his diary, available to anyone who wants to read them. And they tell you something about the Amantica of Amantla that all the scholarly descriptions in the world cannot quite replicate. The artisan specialists then, the Amanteca, the goldsmiths, the lapidaries, the obsidian workers, the manuscript painters who produced the screenfold books in which the empire's calendars and histories and tribute records were kept, occupied a particular position in the social order. They were not nobles. They did not hold private land by hereditary right. They did not have the legal privileges and exemptions of the Pippleton, but they had skill, and in this civilization, skill was honored, and the products of their skill were among the most coveted objects in the known world. They served the state, the temple, and the nobility. They produced the visual language of power, and their wards, their guilds, their patron deities, their closed transmission of craft knowledge from generation to generation. All of these gave their lives a coherence and a dignity that had nothing to do with cotton mantles or jade ear spools. Their work was their distinction. Notice, too, the shape of what all three of these lives share: the Tlacotin, the Pochteca, the Amanteca. Each is embedded in a structure larger than themselves. Each operates within a defined role, a guild or condition with its own rules, and its own codes, and its own internal hierarchy. Each has a ceiling, a limit on how far their station can rise, or how openly their success can be displayed, or how freely they can move. And each has, in that ceiling, the specific fingerprint of the obligation machine. You are here, your role is this, you owe this, and beyond that boundary, you do not go without permission. This is the rhythm that pulses through every level of this city, from the bonded person running toward the palace through a crowd that cannot legally stop them, to the disguised merchant memorizing the walls of a foreign city for an army that will follow behind, to the feather worker in Amantla trimming a quetzal plume for the headdress of a god-king who cannot be looked at. Each is part of the same mechanism. Each is performing their obligation. Each is paying their portion of a debt that runs, unbroken, from the very bottom of the pyramid to the very top, and from the top, as we will come to understand, all the way up to the gods themselves. For now, though, we are not yet at the top. We have not yet reached the warrior's world of captives taken alive and costumes that upgrade with each one, or the nobles in their cotton and gold who face execution for the very drunkenness a 52-year-old farmer might enjoy with impunity, or the marketplace where 60,000 people traded on a single morning and a row of stalls sold nothing but human waste. We have not yet reached the man no one was permitted to look at, who changed his clothes several times a day and never wore the same garment twice, and who nonetheless owed a debt so vast that no amount of gold or labor or human blood had ever been able to settle it. We are moving toward all of that, slowly as this city moves wood and on water, on long causeways, with the patience of a civilization that has organized every hour of every day and knows that the next hour will come in its proper order, because the calendar has demanded it, and the priests have confirmed it, and the obligation chain holds. The night is quiet around you, the lake is dark. Somewhere in a ward across the city, A Pochteca caravan is moving through the streets in the last hour before dawn, bundled goods on the backs of porters, the scent of cacao and distant forests. Somewhere in a mantla, a feather worker's household is sleeping, the half-finished work set aside until morning light, the Quetzal feathers wrapped carefully to protect their color. Somewhere in the market precinct of Tlatelolco, the vendors are beginning to arrive, the first stalls setting out their goods before the city wakes and the trading begins. And somewhere, in the shadow of the great temple, a young man is thinking about the 4 enemies he needs to take alive, and the costume that waits for him on the other side of that achievement, and the cotton it is made from, and the rank it represents, and the world that opens once you have proven, with your hands and your nerve, that you are worth more than the maguey fibers your mother wove for you at birth. We will follow him next. The young man whose thoughts you have just glimpsed in the shadow of the great temple has been waiting his whole life for a single morning. Not the morning of his birth, though that morning mattered enormously. The priests consulted the Tonalpohualli, the sacred 260-day ritual calendar, and determined whether his day sign was favorable, and if it was not, they held the naming ceremony back until a better day arrived, and the luck of that delayed day followed him forward into everything he would ever do. Not the morning he entered the Telpochcalli, the house of youth where commoner boys were sent to learn the shape of the world, its history, its obligations, its wars. Those mornings made him. But the morning he is waiting for is different. It is the morning after his first battle, the morning he walks back through the causeway gate with another man's wrists bound behind him, a prisoner taken alive from the field, and the whole weight of the social order shifts just slightly in his direction. In the Aztec world, you were not ranked by birth alone, though birth mattered. You were not ranked by wealth alone, though wealth had its language too. At the level of the warrior, rank was measured in captives, not in the number of enemies you had killed. Killing was wasteful, a waste of the gods' due, a waste of the tribute the sacrifice system required. The man who killed his opponent on the field had taken nothing of lasting value. The man who dragged his opponent home alive had delivered something the whole cosmic order needed. He had fed the machine. And so the system of insignia, of rank made visible in cloth and color, was built entirely around that single act, the capture. Your first captive changed your clothes, literally. The mantles permitted to you, the cloak draped over your shoulders in the street, the headdress or its absence, the ornament at your lip. All of it tracked the count of the men you had brought home breathing. A warrior who had yet to take any captive wore a particular plain hairstyle, a long lock left at the back of his head, uncut, a mark legible to every person who saw him on the road. It was not a mark of shame exactly, or not yet. He was young, untested, and the world had not yet shown him a field where he could prove himself. But it was a mark of incompleteness. The lock said, "This man has not yet paid his first debt to the system. He is still in arrears." The social weight of that uncut lock was considerable. A young man who reached full adulthood, who grew old enough that the absence of a captive was no longer explicable by youth, wore that hairstyle differently than the boy fresh from the Telpochcalli. It became a statement, and not a welcome one. The world around him had a way of noting what a man had and had not done, and this empire was built on the premise that every person owed something. The untested warrior owed a captive. Until he delivered it, the lock remained. The first capture changed everything. A new set of mantles, a new right to wear a particular style of cloak, the first acknowledgement from the military structure that here was a man who had begun to repay what he owed. The second capture elevated him further. The third, further still. Each step Up this ladder was not merely honorific. It was material, visible, encoded in cloth and feather, and the precise color of the war suit he was permitted to wear into battle. Different combinations of orange and white and red and black, different configurations of feather and padding tracked his rank with the precision that a modern military uniform tracks medals. Anyone who saw him walking through Tenochtitlan could read in his clothing the story of what he had done, and above a certain threshold the doors opened to something extraordinary. For a commoner born to the Kalpuli, born to Magay fiber cloth and collective farmland, and the modest obligations of the Macahualtin, the military pathway offered the single most dramatic form of social ascent the empire provided. Take enough captives, demonstrate sufficient courage and skill, and controlled aggression in the service of the cosmic order, and a commoner could be elevated to the rank of Quaupili, the eagle noble, a commoner made noble not by lineage but by war. This is where the open loop you were given earlier in this night finally closes. You were told in the first hour of this narration that there was a legal way for a commoner to earn the right to wear cotton. This is that way. The Quaupili status brought with it access to the material markers of nobility, the cotton garments, the gold ornaments, the rank insignia that were otherwise forbidden on pain of death to anyone born outside the Pipiltin. The farmer's son, who had grown up forbidden by law from wearing anything softer than the rough woven ixtal of the maguey plant, could, by dragging 4 enemies home alive from the field, earn the right to wrap himself in the same fine cotton cloth that noble blood had always promised its inheritors. It was not a gift. Nothing in this empire was given without being earned through obligation. But it was real. And it was one of the few passages between the world you were born into and the world that sat above it. The elite warrior orders were the destination toward which all of this pointed. The Quautli, the eagle warriors, and the Oxalotl, the jaguar warriors, were the apex of the military hierarchy, the fighting orders whose names announced their members' mastery in the field. To be an eagle warrior was to wear the eagle's head as a helmet, the curved beak framing your face, your body armored in the fitted cotton warsuit that had been stiffened with rock salt and could stop an obsidian-edged blow. To be a jaguar warrior was to wear the spotted pelt, the animal's jaw open above your own face, and to move through the field as the jaguar moved through the forest with the particular stillness that precedes absolute violence. These were not ceremonial titles. These warriors trained, they fought, they led men into the structured chaos of the battlefield, and their ranks were earned through the same accounting of captives that governed every step below them. Both orders had their own meeting houses in the capital, their own spaces within the sacred precinct of Tenochtitlan, where they gathered and performed their own ceremonies and held themselves apart from the untested men still wearing their uncut locks. They were bound to the war god, to Huitzilopochtli, whose temple rose at the heart of the city and whose appetite for blood was the empire's primary engine of expansion. The more the empire fought, the more captives arrived. The more captives arrived, the more the gods received what the priests told them the gods required. The more the gods received what they required, the more the sun continued to rise. It was a closed system, rationally organized around a terrifying premise. And the eagle warriors and jaguar warriors were the living instruments of it. Now consider the machine that produced these warriors in such reliable quantities. The Xochiaoyotl, the flower wars. The term translates roughly as the flowery war or the war of flowers, and the name is beautiful in a way that almost conceals what the thing actually was. The flower wars were arranged, ritualized, scheduled conflicts between the Aztec Triple Alliance and specific rival states, most notably Tlaxcala to the east, and Huejotzingo, not far from it. These were enemies of a particular kind, states that the Aztecs had not yet absorbed into the tributary system, or had deliberately chosen not to absorb because they served a different and arguably more valuable purpose than tribute. They served as training grounds. They served as the source. The Flower Wars were fought not to conquer territory and not to destroy the enemy's capacity to resist. They were fought to capture warriors, to drag home the skilled, the brave, the physically formidable fighters that the sacrifice system required, and to give young Aztec warriors the field experience and the captive count that the ranking system demanded. They were, in the coldest analytical sense, a renewable harvest. The Tlaxcalans and the Huejotzinca were the field, and the Aztec warriors were the farmers, and the crop they were raising was live human beings to be brought home and offered to the sun. This had consequences that the empire may or may not have fully calculated. The Tlaxcalans who survived the Flower Wars, who fought back and won their engagements and carried their own Aztec prisoners home, accumulated generations of grievance and practice. They were among the finest warriors in the region precisely because they had been sharpening themselves against the Aztec military machine for years, and they had reasons to hate the empire that went beyond the abstract resentment that tribute could generate. When, in the early 16th century, a group of armored strangers arrived on the coast from the east, the Tlaxcalans would make a calculation about allies that would help reshape everything. But that is the shadow at the edge of this story, not its center. For now, what matters is the warrior standing in the field, the captive's wrists bound to his own, and the life that opens on the other side of that moment. He would eat better. He would dress better. He would sit in different places at the feasts, receive different cuts of meat, drink the frothy zocolatl, the cacao drink that was poured for warriors and nobles, while commoners made do with water and pulque when the calendar allowed it. He would look different in the street, and the city would read his difference and respond to it. He would have been made, through the controlled violence of the battlefield and the precise accounting of the state, into something the Calpulli could not have made him. A man whose rank was visible, whose debt to the system had been paid in the only currency that bought real elevation, and who stood now at the edge of the world that sat above the Masihualtin. That world was the world of the Pipiltin. And to step into it, even as a Qualpilli who had earned his way in rather than been born to it, was to enter a system whose obligations were no lighter than the ones below it, only different, and in some ways considerably more dangerous. The Pipiltin, the nobility, the hereditary class of the Pili, were the administrators, the judges, the priests of high rank, the military commanders, the governors of subject territories, the inner council of the empire. They were the descendants of rulers, the inheritors of the bloodlines that the cosmic order had elevated, and their privileges were real and extensive, and encoded in law with the same precision that the sumptuary codes had been encoded for commoners, only pointing the opposite direction. Where the law told the Masihualtin what they could not wear, it told the Pipiltin what they alone were permitted to wear, and the list was long and specific and astonishing. Cotton was the first marker and the most fundamental. The Pipiltin wore cotton as a matter of course, fine white mantles, elaborately woven cloaks in geometric patterns, garments whose softness against the skin was itself a statement about the distance between their lives and the lives of the people who wore ixtl. But cotton alone was only the beginning. A noble of sufficient rank wore a gold labrée, a lip plug of beaten gold fitted through a piercing below the lower lip, catching the light when he spoke. He wore jade ear spools, the discs of polished green stone, expanding the earlobe in a way that communicated with each glance the precise level of his standing. He might wear a feather headdress of extraordinary complexity, the Amanteca's finest work, the Quetzal plumes arranged in arching fans of iridescent green gold that moved when he moved, so that the light seemed to travel with him, as though he were attended by his own personal atmosphere. These things were not merely pretty. They were a visual language, a system of information carrying as precise as anything the priests had written in the codices, and anyone walking through the streets of Tenochtitlan could read it. You knew at a glance whether the person approaching you was a minor noble of local administrative rank, or a high military commander, or a member of the inner council. You knew it from the number and size of the jade discs at his ears. You knew it from the color and arrangement of the feathers at his head. You knew it from the particular pattern woven into his cloak and from the sandals on his feet. Commoners went barefoot, but the privilege of wearing sandals was itself graduated, and the style and material of the sandal communicated what rank had permitted it. This was a city that was, in effect, a living document. Every person moving through its streets was simultaneously a reader and a text, encoding their place in the system, in the fabric and adornment of their body, and reading everyone else's encoding in return. Nothing was accidental, nothing was purely personal taste or private expression. Your clothing was your civic identity, your legal status, your relationship to the obligation chain made manifest in wool and jade, and the structural complexity of tropical birds. The Pipiltin held private land, separate from the Kalpulli's collective holdings that the Macahualtin worked and could lose if they failed to tend it for 2 years running. Noble land was heritable, personal, and not subject to the same mechanisms of forfeiture. They were exempt from the ordinary tribute and labor obligations that fell on the Macahualtin. They did not owe the state the same quantities of maize and cloth and corvée labor that filled the great tribute warehouses of the capital. Their obligation to the state was expressed differently in administration, in military leadership, in the governance of subject territories, in the conduct of ritual, and in the maintenance of the social order that made all the other obligations possible. They were educated in the Kalmakak, the House of the Elders, the higher school, where the curriculum was considerably more rigorous and more esoteric than the Telpochkali's training in warfare and civic duty. The Kalmakak taught the reading and writing of the codices, the complex astronomy that underpinned the dual calendar system, the precise protocols of ritual, the history of the ruling lineage, the conduct of diplomacy, and the law. It was also deeply harsh. Students at the Kalmakak were subject to severe discipline, woken before dawn for cold water bathing, and ritual fasting, punished for infractions with maguey thorn bloodletting administered to their own bodies as an offering. The elite education was not comfortable. It was a training in endurance as much as in knowledge, and what it produced were people who could administer a complex imperial system across hundreds of subject communities while managing the ritual calendar that governed every aspect of public life. A select group of commoner children, gifted students, or those chosen by their communities, could also be sent to the Kalmakak, the same way a particularly distinguished warrior could be elevated to the Quaupili. The system was not sealed, but the Pipiltin were its intended graduates, and the Kalmakak shaped them from childhood to inhabit the roles the empire needed, filled at its higher levels. And here is the part of noble life that is perhaps the most striking to consider from the outside. The Pipiltin were held to harsher legal standards than the commoners they governed. Not lighter, harsher. A commoner found publicly drunk, pulque, the fermented maguey sap that was the common alcohol of the realm, consumed in violation of the strict regulations that confined its legal use mostly to the elderly and to specific festival days, faced punishment. The Codex Mendoza records it with its characteristic precision: beatings, public humiliation, shaving of the head. These were serious consequences, but a noble found publicly drunk faced something considerably worse. The noble's intoxication was not merely a personal failing, it was a failure of the visibility that rank imposed. The Pipiltin were the visible embodiment of order, the living argument that the hierarchy was legitimate and that those at the top of it deserved to be there. A noble who stumbled through the street with pulque on his breath had undermined that argument in front of everyone who saw him. The punishment for that was death. The same asymmetry applied to other offences. Adultery among commoners was addressed through the legal system with punishments that varied by circumstance and by the status of the people involved. Adultery by a noble, particularly by a noble, in a position of public trust and symbolic authority, could be capital. Treason, the betrayal of the state, the leaking of military intelligence to an enemy, the conspiracy against the ruling lineage, was of course lethal at any social level, but for a noble, it carried the additional weight of having violated not merely a law, but a sacred compact. The Pipiltin were not simply administrators. They were the custodians of the cosmic order's earthly expression, and to corrupt that custodianship was to corrupt the order itself. This is an empire where more power brought more scrutiny, not less. Where the man with the finest cotton and the gold labre at his lip was the man whose public drunkenness could get him killed, while the man in Ixtal fibre might survive the same lapse with a shaved head. The hierarchy was not purely a pyramid of privilege, it was a pyramid of obligation in which every rung carried its own particular form of debt to the system, and the higher you rose, the more the system asked of you in return for what it gave. The management of noble family alliances was itself a kind of statecraft. The Pipiltin practiced polygyny, a principal wife and multiple additional wives, each additional union a thread in the diplomatic web that held the empire's subordinate territories in their proper relationship to the capital. A ruler who took a wife from a subject community was not merely expanding his household, he was creating a kinship tie that made the subject community's elite partly invested in his lineage, that gave the children born from that union a stake in both worlds, that wove the cloth of political obligation through the most intimate possible mechanism. The principal wife's son was typically the heir, but succession was not purely a matter of primogeniture, of the firstborn inheriting without question. The High Council of Nobles confirmed the succession, sometimes choosing among brothers rather than passing the title directly downward, and the allied rulers of Texcoco and Tlacopan had their own perspectives on the matter. The empire's leadership was, in this sense, a negotiation as much as an inheritance, the highest stakes version of the same collaborative obligation that governed the Kalpulli's management of its collective land. And so you move through the noble world, through the private landed estates and the Karl-Macaque-educated sons and the gold labre conversations at the palace precinct and the feather headdress formalities of ceremony, and you understand it as the same system you saw at the bottom of the pyramid, only operating at a higher altitude and with correspondingly higher stakes. The Msehualtin owed tribute and labor and military service to the Kalpulli and the state. The Pipiltin owed administration and ritual and military leadership and the visible performance of order. Both groups owed, both groups paid, both groups operated within a framework of law so detailed and so consistently enforced that the city of 200,000 people functioned with a coherence that would astonish the Spanish soldiers, who eventually looked at it from the causeway and tried to find words for what they were seeing. What they saw, what you are beginning to see. If you have been following the thread of this night's narration down through the commoner wards and the slave markets and the Pochteca caravans and the feather workers' careful hands and the warriors' captive count and the nobles' gold labre obligations, is a city that is not merely large but organized at every level according to the same fundamental principle. Not freedom, not equality, not the accumulation of individual wealth without reference to collective duty. Obligation. The system of debt running upward and downward and laterally through every relationship, every transaction, every garment, every meal, every captive dragged home from the field. The warrior who has just earned his quarpili elevation is part of this system. The noble who must remain sober in public or face execution is part of this system. The merchant who returns to his ward in the dark before dawn, hiding his wealth to avoid the resentment that conspicuous prosperity would attract, is part of this system. The feather worker in a mantla whose craft is the material expression of the divine order is part of this system. The tlacotin who can own property and marry freely, but who is nonetheless bound by a contract that sells his labor to another until the terms are discharged. He is part of this system too. And at the very top of the pyramid, above the pipiltin, above the military commanders, above the high priests, sits the figure toward whom this whole night has been building. The man whose obligations are the greatest of all, whose debt to the system dwarfs every quachtly cotton cloak and every captive count, and every tribute bin of maize and beans. The man no one in the empire was permitted to look in the face. But before we reach him, we must move through the machinery that sustained the empire he governed. The tribute economy, the market, the currency of cacao and cotton, the great pulsing heart of commerce at Tlatelolco, where 60,000 people gathered to trade in an order so precise and so policed that the Spanish soldiers who saw it wrote home to a king in Europe and said, "We have nothing like this." Nothing in Seville, nothing in Rome, nothing in Constantinople prepares you for what this market is. The night holds that ground ahead of you, calm and unhurried. The lake is very still. The stars are the same ones that the Aztec astronomers had charted with such precision over so many generations that the calendar they built from those observations could predict to the day the events the heavens had scheduled, the eclipses, the conjunctions, the risings and settings of Venus that meant war or peace or the appropriate moment to plant. Everything in this city is organized around the premise that the cosmos has a schedule and that human obligation is the mechanism by which that schedule is honored. There is more to see. Settle in. The tribute warehouses are full and the market is about to open. The warrior's path into that hierarchy of obligation begins not with a title or a birth or a council's decision, but with a moment in the field, a moment of seizing, of dragging, of bringing back a living man instead of a dead one. This is the thing that surprises people who carry certain assumptions into this history. Killing your enemy was not the measure. Any frightened soldier can kill. What the Aztec military system asked of its men was harder, stranger, and in its own way more revealing of how this civilization organized its values. You had to capture him, alive. You had to bring him home breathing, walk him into Tenochtitlan with your hand on his arm, deliver him to the priests still living. The calculus was theological. A dead enemy on the battlefield fed no god, settled no cosmic debt, kept no sun rising. But a living captive, a heart still beating, was a payment. And your rank rose with every payment you made on the empire's behalf. The first captive you took changed your clothing. Not a metaphor. Your literal garments changed because clothing in this world was not personal expression, but legal status made textile. Before your first capture, you wore what your birth had assigned you: maguey fiber, the rough cloth of the agave plant, the coarse weave of the commoner. After your first captive, you earned the right to certain warrior mantles. After the second and third, the costume grew more elaborate, more colored, more clearly expensive. By the time a man had taken 4 captives in the field, he had moved so far up the visual register of Aztec dress that no one on a street in Tenochtitlan could mistake his standing. The highest rungs of this martial hierarchy crystallized into the orders that the Spanish would later find so extraordinary they described them at length and drew them in manuscripts: the Cuautli, the Eagle Warriors, and the Ocelotl, the Jaguar Warriors. These were not mere honorifics. The eagle and the jaguar were creatures of celestial and earthly power. The eagle who flew into the sun, the jaguar who moved through the darkness of the underworld, and the warriors who wore their forms wore the power of those realms on their bodies in battle. Full animal head helmets, suits of cotton armor covered in feathers or spotted hide, a silhouette so distinctive that an enemy across a field of combat would know immediately who was walking toward him and what level of dread that walk warranted. The orders were open to commoners. This is the thing worth pausing on in the darkness of this hour, in the quiet of whatever room you have arranged around yourself tonight. Birth was not the only door. A man born in a Kalpali ward, born to a family of farmers or fishers, born into the rough cloth of the Makahawali, could through the act of capturing enough enemies arrive at a status the system called Quaupili, Eagle Noble. The cotton loop that had been forbidden to him by sumptuary law his whole life could be earned through war. The gold labré, the jade ear spool, the feathered cloak, these were not permanently sealed behind the wall of noble birth if a man's hands were capable enough, and lucky enough, and willing enough to reach across a battlefield and close around a living enemy. This was the empire's offer to its commoners. Not freedom. Nothing in this system was about freedom, but mobility. The ladder was real. The rungs were made of captives, and for the young man who had not yet taken one, the social cost of that failure was made visible in the most intimate and involuntary way imaginable. He wore a particular hairstyle, a cut and arrangement that announced to everyone who looked at him that he had not yet proven himself in battle. In a city this organized, this legible, this devoted to making status readable at a glance, wearing that hairstyle past the age when other men had already earned their first captive was a slow, daily, public shame. It was not a punishment imposed from outside. It was the absence of the thing that would have announced arrival. He could not hide it. The city read him every time he walked through a market, every time he passed a court official, every time he stood near men whose costumes told a different story. The pressure this created was exactly what the system was designed to create, and the flower wars, the Xochiaoyotl, were designed to channel that pressure outward into something productive for the state. These were not wars of conquest. The Aztecs were not trying to take Tlaxcalan land. They were not trying to absorb Huejotzingo into the empire's administrative apparatus, not trying to install new tribute collectors in those valleys or redirect their cacao shipments toward Tenochtitlan. What they wanted was simpler and more precise. They wanted warm bodies, trained warriors, men who knew how to fight and had the physical conditioning of soldiers, captives who would make worthy offerings. And so arranged battles were conducted, scheduled, understood by both sides to be a kind of ritual harvest, and both sides sent their warriors into the field knowing that capture was the point, and that the captives' road ended at the Templo Mayor's summit. There is something in this that the sleep-eased mind, drifting toward the edge of consciousness, may find it useful to simply hold rather than to analyze too quickly. The flower wars were sustainable by design. Tlaxcala and Huejotzingo remained independent precisely because the Aztec Empire needed them to remain independent, needed them to go on producing warriors worth capturing. A conquered, administered Tlaxcala would have been a tribute province. An unconquered Tlaxcala was a renewable harvest. The same logical precision that ran through the tribute collection apparatus through the cacao currency counterfeit policing market judges, through the sumptuary laws that assigned cloth by legal category, ran through the arrangement of ritual warfare. Nothing in this system was accidental. The organization went all the way down. And above the warrior, above the man with his captives counted and his costume upgraded, and his quapili status perhaps newly conferred, sat the layer that had not needed to earn its position through battle, though battle was part of what it did to maintain it. The Pipiltin were the hereditary nobility, and the differences between their lives and the lives of the Makehualtin were not subtle. They were written into every surface of daily existence. The land a noble held was his own in a way that commoner Kalpuli land was not. Private land, heritable, worked by others rather than by his own hands, producing income rather than subsistence. Tribute obligations that reached down through the pyramid and squeezed the farmer in his adobe house simply did not apply to the Pili. He received tribute, he did not pay it. His children went to the Kalmakak. The Kalmakak was not the Telpoch Kali of the commoner boys. It was a more rigorous institution, more intellectually demanding, more devoted to the kinds of knowledge that ran an empire, the reading and writing of the codices, the intricate calculations of the two interlocking calendars, the protocols of law and court, the ceremonial obligations of priesthood, the rhetoric that a man would need if he were going to stand before a council of high lords and be taken seriously. The Kalmakak also produced priests, and priests in this world were not separate from power. They were one of its primary expressions. The noble's body announced his rank before he opened his mouth. Cotton, where the commoner wore maguey. A gold labrée pierced through the lower lip, gleaming at the chin. Jade ear spools in the lobes, green and heavy and cool. Feather headdresses of a complexity and a color saturation that required the work of the Amanteka, the specialist feather workers in their ward of Amantla, and the feathers of tropical birds that had traveled hundreds of miles in tribute shipments to arrive in Tenochtitlan and be sorted and selected and arranged by hands trained since childhood to make this particular kind of beauty. The rank encoded in these objects was not approximate. A practiced eye in a Tenochtitlan street could read a man's precise position in the hierarchy from his jewelry and his cloth, the way a modern eye reads a uniform's insignia. And yet the Pipiltin labored under obligations the commoner did not carry. The law watched noble conduct with a stricter attention. A commoner caught drunk in public faced punishment, beatings, public humiliation, consequences that escalated with repetition. But a young noble caught publicly drunk-faced execution. The visibility of rank worked in both directions. You received more, and the system demanded more of your behavior in return. Adultery among nobles could mean death. Treason was death. The public drunkenness that might merely shame a farmer could end a noble's life by the state's hand. This was not arbitrary harshness. It was the same logic that ran through everything else in this organized world. The higher you stood in the chain of obligation, the more the chain cost you personally. Polygyny among the noble class was not simply a personal indulgence, it was political technology. A ruler who took wives from subordinate towns bound those towns to him through the bodies and futures of their daughters. The principal wife's son was typically the heir, but succession in practice moved through the royal lineage in more complex patterns than simple primogeniture, confirmed by a council of senior nobles and allied rulers rather than automatic descent. Marriage at this level was alliance-making conducted through the most intimate possible instrument. And now, at the top of the human portion of this pyramid, we arrive at the mechanism that held everything together, the system that made the obligation chain not merely a philosophy, but a physical reality a flowing network of goods and food and cloth and gold that moved ceaselessly from the farthest edges of the empire toward its center, toward Tenochtitlan, like blood moving toward a heart. The Triple Alliance, formed around the year 1428, was the engine. 3 cities, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, had joined their military ambitions into a single coordinating body, and what they built in the century that followed was one of the most efficient tributary systems in the pre-modern world. The arrangement was straightforward in its design, if staggering in its scale. Subject peoples were conquered and then they were taxed. Not administered in detail, not colonized in the later European sense, but taxed, regularly, reliably, and with the understanding that failure to pay would bring the armies back. The Codex Mendoza, a document compiled in the early years after the Spanish arrival under indigenous direction, records the specifics with an accountant's precision. You can open it now, across the centuries, and read the lists, page after page of painted figures, each a pictograph of a particular good, with numbers attached. Hundreds of thousands of cotton cloaks and mantles from the cloth-producing regions. Bins of maize, bins of beans, bins of chia and amaranth, measured in enormous containers called quawikali, arriving from agricultural provinces on fixed schedules. War costumes complete with their elaborate feathered shields, ready to be issued to warriors. Bales of tropical feathers, sacks of gold dust, weighed in quills of standardized size so the dust could not be tampered with. Bags of cacao beans from the warm lowland regions where the trees grew. Jars of honey, loads of copal incense for the temples, lime for construction and for nixtamalization, rubber balls for the ritual ball game. The lists go on and on and on. What the Codex Mendoza is recording, in its painted columns, is the circulatory system of an empire. Every item on those lists was once someone's labor. The weaver, who worked the cotton loom, the farmer who harvested and dried and sacked the maize, the metalworker who separated the gold from the alluvial gravel of a mountain river, the cultivator who tended the cacao trees in a lowland orchard. The tribute was extracted labor, made portable, and it flowed on human backs along the great roads and on canoes along the canal networks toward the capital, where it fed the noble class, the warriors, the priesthood, the artisans, the markets, and the gods. The men who enforced this flow were the Kalpiksk, the tribute collectors. They lived in the subject towns, permanent representatives of Tenochtitlan's authority, and their power over local populations was total and visible, and by many accounts, deliberately humiliating. They carried fans and flowers as symbols of office. They did not work with their hands. They walked through towns whose people were required to provide for their comfort while delivering the empire's cut. The resentment this generated was not invisible to later observers. When Hernán Cortés arrived on the coast in 1519 and began looking for allies against the Mexica, he found them almost immediately. The Totonacs, the Tlaxcalans, the Texcocans, dozens of subject and rival peoples who had calculated that the Spanish, whoever they were and whatever they wanted, were preferable to the Kalpiksk, arriving every season with their fan and their list and their absolute expectation. The hegemonic empire, which had deliberately left local rulers in place to manage their own population so long as tribute flowed, had been generating its own enemies for a century. The Spanish did not destroy Tenochtitlan. They handed resentful tributaries a weapon and stood aside. But that ending is not what we are here for tonight. What matters here, what belongs to our tour through the levels of this extraordinary world, is the felt experience of the tributary obligation. You lived in a conquered province. Your Kalpuli grew cotton, or worked silver, or produced the elaborate feathered war costumes that the Codex Mendoza depicts in careful rows. The season turned, and the delivery date arrived, and you and your neighbors assembled what you owed. Not what you chose to give, but what was written down, what had been set at the moment of your town's incorporation into the Triple Alliance's accounting. You handed it over. The Kalpixk recorded it. And the goods moved north toward the lake, toward the city you had probably never seen, to fill the storehouses of a ruler whose face you were not permitted to imagine encountering. This was the obligation of the conquered. It was not chosen, it was inherited, like the obligation of the farmer to his Kalpali plot, like the obligation of the warrior to his captive tally, like the obligation of the noble to conduct himself with the dignity his clothing announced. The chain ran through every rung, and every link was taut. Among the goods that moved along this chain, two deserved to be considered with particular care because they did something that goods in most societies do not do. They served as money. And the story of how they did this and what happened when people found the system's weaknesses is one of the most human stories in the whole of this empire. Cacao beans were small and brown and grew in pods on trees in the warm lowlands south of the Valley of Mexico, in the regions that now form parts of modern Veracruz, Tabasco, the Yucatan coast, and Guatemala. A single pod contained perhaps 20 to 40 seeds, and once fermented and dried, those seeds became one of the most valued objects in Mesoamerica. They were the cacao bean, and in the markets of Tenochtitlan and across the empire, they functioned as the small change of daily commerce, the low-denomination currency without which ordinary transactions would be impossibly cumbersome. The exchange rates that survive from early Spanish sources, recorded in the first years after the conquest, when the old system was still mostly functioning, give us a picture of the scale. A ripe avocado might cost 3 cacao beans. A tamale, fresh from the griddle, cost a single bean. A turkey hen, a substantial animal, the household protein source of the prosperous family, might cost on the order of 100 beans, depending on its size and the season. A turkey egg, small and precious, cost about 3. A rabbit cost roughly 30. These are approximate figures preserved through the filter of early colonial recollection, but they give you the texture of what it meant to carry a small pouch of cacao beans to market. You were carrying the ability to negotiate dozens of small daily transactions, the way a modern wallet carries coins and small bills. And what do people do with any widely accepted currency? They counterfeit it. The sources, and this detail appears in Bernardino de Sahagún's great Florentine Codex, that encyclopedic record of Nahua life compiled from indigenous informants in the years after the conquest, describe a fraud so elegant in its simplicity that it requires almost no translation across 5 centuries. Someone, somewhere in the empire, discovered that a cacao bean's shell, once carefully hollowed, could be refilled with mud or dried dough, sealed, and offered in the market as though it were whole. The weight was approximately correct. The appearance was approximately correct. Unless you broke the bean open and looked inside, you could not easily tell the difference. And so the cacao counterfeiters passed their mud-filled shells alongside the real ones, pocketing the difference between a real bean's purchasing power and the cost of a pinch of dirt. This is not a trivial detail. The existence of cacao counterfeiting tells us something important about how seriously the beans were treated as money. You do not go to the trouble of forging currency unless it is worth forging. The market judges at Tlatelolco were aware of this fraud and alert to it. The inspection of goods that the sources describe included, presumably, the kind of scrutiny a careful trader would apply to any suspicious handful of beans. The empire had, in other words, not just a currency, but the economic anxieties that accompany any currency, the worry about authenticity, the structures of verification, the social machinery of trust. For the higher value transactions, the ones that required more purchasing power than 100 cacao beans could conveniently represent. There was a second monetary instrument, The cuachtli was a large white cotton cloak, a mantle of standardized size and quality, and it occupied the role of higher denomination currency in the same way that a large bill occupies a different role than coins. Depending on the quality of the weave and the fineness of the cotton, a cuachtli was valued at somewhere between 65 and 100 cacao beans, according to the various early colonial sources that attempted to document these equivalencies. This range reflects real variation. A finer mantle was worth more than a coarser one, just as a higher denomination note in a modern currency system carries more value than a worn and degraded version. What the cuachtli represents beyond its immediate monetary function is the intimacy of this economy with the textile system we have already visited, the sumptuary law that forbade commoners their cotton, the tribute lists that counted cotton mantles in the hundreds of thousands, the weaving labor of countless women across the empire's cotton-producing regions. The cloak that a Pippleton nobleman wore to signal his rank was, simultaneously, a unit of currency. The tribute payment that a conquered province owed was, partly, a shipment of money. The garment and the coin were the same object. This is not a confusion, but a sophistication. In an economy without minted metal coins, the most durable, portable, standardized, and widely desired commodity becomes the medium of exchange, and in Mesoamerica, fine woven cotton was exactly that. A man's self-sale price into Tlacotin bondage was reckoned in cuachtli, roughly 20 of them as the sources describe, for a healthy adult male in ordinary circumstances. 20 cotton cloaks, each worth perhaps 80 cacao beans, each worth many dozens of small daily purchases. This is what a human being's labor contract was priced at in this world, and the specificity of it, not a lot or some goods, but 20 cuachtli, a number you can almost count on your fingers, reminds you that this was a functional, literate accounting economy, not a vague, pre-literate barter system. They knew exactly what things cost, they wrote it down. All of these exchanges, all of these transactions in cacao and cotton and gold and feathers and rubber and copal and every other thing the empire produced or extracted converged in a single place. And that place was the great market of Tlatelolco. Tlatelolco was a city island adjacent to Tenochtitlan, linked by causeways and canals, and its market was the commercial heart of not just the Lake District, but arguably the entire hemisphere. Spanish soldiers who arrived in Tenochtitlan in 1519 climbed to the top of the Great Temple and looked out over the market from above, and what they described in their accounts reads, not like men encountering a primitive bazaar, but like men encountering something that exceeded what they knew from home. Hernán Cortés, writing his Cartas de Relación, his letters to the Spanish King Charles V, intended partly as self-promotion, but containing detailed and largely reliable descriptions of what he observed, wrote that the market was larger and better ordered than any market he had seen in Spain, and that it equaled or exceeded the markets of Rome and Constantinople in variety and organization. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a soldier who was there and who later wrote his own account, in old age from memory, was more vivid. He wrote that the market astonished soldiers who had traveled to Italy, to France, to markets across the Mediterranean world, that the order and the sheer volume of what was being sold simply surpassed their experience. He struggled, he said, to name everything for sale because it seemed there was nothing under the sun that could not be found there. The figures the Spanish sources give for attendance are the figures we have, and they should be understood as estimates observed from outside a society that counted in different ways and for different purposes. On an ordinary day, 20,000 to 25,000 people were estimated to be trading in the Tlatelolco market. On the Great Market Day, held on a 5-day cycle, because the Aztec week was 5 days rather than 7, the number was estimated at 40,000 to 60,000. 60,000 people in one place buying and selling. The city of Tenochtitlan itself held perhaps 200,000 to 250,000 people. The market day drew a quarter of the entire city's population, and then more from the surrounding lake communities and from trading expeditions that had traveled days or weeks to reach it. The organization of the market is what the Spanish observers return to repeatedly, and it is the detail that most clearly illustrates the level of administrative sophistication at work here. Goods were not sold in a general milling chaos. They were segregated by type into dedicated sections, each in its assigned place, reliable from one market day to the next. There was a section for gold work and jewelry, where the goldsmiths displayed their lost wax castings and the jewelers their jade and turquoise inlays. There was a section for cloth, cotton mantles, ixtal fiber garments, embroidered pieces, raw fiber, where you could find, essentially, the entire textile economy of the empire on display. There was a section for food, fresh produce, prepared tamales and tortillas, stews sold from clay pots, dried chilies roped together in braids. There was a section for herbs, medicines and plant remedies, an apothecary district in the open air. There was a section for pottery, a section for lumber and building materials, a section for slaves. Men and women sold wearing wooden collars around their necks to indicate their status, each with a price reckoned in quactli and cacao, each standing or sitting in the assigned area where human labor was traded. And then there was the section that never fails to arrest a reader when they encounter it in Bernal Diaz's account, a dedicated room for the sale of human excrement. The waste collected from the public latrines and the canoes that ferried it from the city streets was a genuine commodity, sold to tanners who needed it for the curing of hides and to farmers who needed it for the enrichment of their chinampa gardens. The city's waste management system, which the Spanish also noted with astonishment, a city of 200,000 people with public latrines, street cleaning crews, and canoes dedicated to removing human waste from the canal system, was simultaneously a supply chain for a commercial market. Nothing was discarded. Everything had a value, a buyer, and an assigned place in the orderly rows of Tlatelolco. And over all of this, over the cacao counterfeits and the cotton cloaks and the quetzal feather capes and the wooden collared slaves and the buckets of collected excrement, sat the judges. The market of Tlatelolco had a permanent court operating within its bounds. A panel of appointed judges sat in a dedicated space and heard disputes as they arose in real time. The merchant, who claimed he had been given counterfeit cacao, the buyer, who argued he had received fewer mantles than agreed, the trader, who accused another of selling goods without authorization. Officials walked the rows, inspecting what was offered for sale, checking measures and weights, and the authenticity of what was claimed. The fine for cheating in the Tlatelolco market was not a slap on the wrist. This was a state institution operating under the authority of the Triple Alliance, and it enforced the rules of commerce with the same seriousness that the same state enforced the sumptuary law about cotton clothing. Order here was not a polite fiction, it was maintained by people with authority to punish. Think about what this market represents for a moment for the people who traveled to it. The farmer from a chinampa on the lake's edge, loading surplus beans and dried chili into a canoe before dawn. The Pochteca returning from months in the south, carrying bales of quetzal feathers and bags of cacao through the market's cloth section, comparing prices before delivering the bulk of it to the palace storehouses. The artisan from Amantla, the feather workers' ward, selling a completed mosaic shield to a noble's representative who had been authorized to purchase war equipment. The woman from a tributary town selling the extra pottery her household had produced above the tribute quota. The slave's master negotiating a price for a healthy adult in the dedicated section, reckoning the value in quachtli. Each of them, at some point in the course of a market day, might pass through half a dozen of the market's dedicated zones, conducting transactions in cacao beans for the small ones and in cotton cloaks for the larger ones, watched over by the judges and the inspectors in a space that was, by any measure, one of the great commercial achievements of the pre-modern world. And above all of them, above the market and the tribute system and the merchant guilds and the artisan wards and the warrior orders and the noble houses and the commoner Calpulli plots, above every rung of the ladder we have climbed tonight, there was one man, the Huey Tlatoani, the great speaker, great. He was not born to the position in the way a European king was born. As the automatic heir of the man before him, his claim established from birth, and his succession essentially predetermined. The Huey Tlatoani was chosen. A council of senior nobles, together with the rulers of Texcoco and Tlacopan, the Triple Alliance's other members, selected the next great speaker from among the eligible men of the royal lineage, which was broad enough to include multiple candidates and narrow enough to exclude everyone who was not of divine descent. The selection process involved genuine deliberation, genuine politics, and genuine competition among potential successors. Then the choice was made, the rituals of installation were performed, and the chosen man became something that no other human being in the empire was. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, Moctezuma II, as he is known in most historical accounts, the ruler who would be present when the Spanish arrived, had held the title since 1502. By 1519 he had been the great speaker for 17 years. The protocols that surrounded him were not by that point the innovations of one man's vanity, but the accumulated ritual requirements of an office that understood itself as the hinge between the human world and the divine one. No one looked at him directly. This is not a figure of speech or a poetic exaggeration. The prohibition was literal and enforced. When subjects approached Moctezuma, when nobles came to report, when ambassadors arrived, when even the highest Pipiltin in the empire sought an audience, they removed their sandals at the entrance to his presence. They changed out of whatever fine clothing they normally wore and put on plain, unadorned mantles. They walked with their eyes downcast, their gazes on the floor. They did not lift their eyes to his face. When the audience was over, they backed away, still not turning, never presenting their backs to him until they were far enough from his presence that turning would no longer communicate disrespect. His clothing changed multiple times each day, and he never wore the same garment twice. Think about what that single detail means logistically in terms of the labor required to supply it. An endless production of new garments of the highest quality, worn once and set aside, replaced the next day by something equally elaborate. Hundreds of dishes were prepared for each of his meals. Bernal Diaz describes the variety with the breathless specificity of a man who could not quite believe what he was seeing. Turkeys, deer, pheasants, wild boar, pigeons, hares, rabbits, prepared in every manner the empire's cooks could devise, and from all of them the Huey Tlatoani selected a few that suited him. The rest went to the members of his household, and the household was itself vast. Attendants, servants, administrators, guards, wives and their households, the specialists who maintained his aviary and his zoo. The aviary housed birds from across the empire and beyond. Eagles and parrots and toucans and resplendent quetzals and herons and roseate spoonbills, each in appropriate space, tended by keepers who understood their particular needs. The zoo, which was something genuinely unprecedented in the scale of what the Spanish observed, housed jaguars and pumas and ocelots in wooden cages, eagles and vultures in great enclosures, snakes of the lowland rainforest, and, recorded in the Spanish sources, though the detail is uncertain, people with physical differences, dwarfs and albinos and others, maintained as part of the same collection of the remarkable and the extraordinary that the Huey Tlatoani gathered as an expression of his dominion over the entire range of what the world contained. His palace and its gardens covered an area the Spanish compared to entire neighborhoods in their own cities. There were botanical gardens where medicinal and ornamental plants were maintained. There were pools and water features. The aqueducts from Chapultepec that brought fresh water across the causeways served the city, but the palace had its own supply, its own baths, its own sanitation arrangements. This was not simply a wealthy man's house. It was a parallel world, a second city within the city, organized around the person of the one human being who stood at the exact point where human obligation met divine demand. And here we arrive at the thing that closes the loop, the thing that the whole tour through this empire's levels has been leading toward. The question we planted at the beginning of this long night's journey, which was, if every rung of this pyramid owed something to the rung above it, what did the man at the very top owe? Who was the Huey Tlatoani paying? What was the obligation that bound even him? The answer is the gods. And the currency was blood. The theology at the heart of the Aztec world was not, in its internal logic, arbitrary or cruel. It was a cosmology of debt, and it was as carefully thought through as the Calpulli land law or the market inspection system, because it came from the same cultural instinct, the instinct that the world operated through mutual obligation, that nothing was given freely, that every gift demanded a return. The current era, the age in which all of these people lived, the fifth sun, had been created when the gods gathered at Teotihuacan in an earlier age and sacrificed themselves to set the sun in motion. The gods had not simply made the world and stepped back. They had paid for it with their own divine blood and lives, and the world they had purchased ran on a debt that humanity owed them in return, a perpetual repayment in human blood and hearts that kept the sun moving across the sky each day and prevented the cosmic darkness from returning. This debt was called the Nextlahualli, the payment, the repayment. The word carries the connotation of something owed and now being settled, an account being brought current, a transaction in progress. Sacrifice was not madness and it was not sadism inside the frame of the people performing it. It was bookkeeping. The gods had paid, humans owed the payment back. The Huey Tlatoani and the priests were the accountants and the cashiers of this cosmic transaction, responsible for ensuring that the account did not fall too far behind, that the sun kept rising, that the rains came to water the chinampas, that the fifth sun did not end. The great gods who demanded this payment were Huitzilopochtli, the sun and war deity, who was simultaneously the patron of the Mexica as a people, their tribal god, the one who had led their legendary migration from the north to the lake where they built their city, and Tlaloc, the ancient rain deity who predated the Mexica by centuries in the Mesoamerican religious landscape, who brought the water that made the chinampas grow and the maize ripen and the people eat. Both demanded their portion. The Templo Maya, the great double pyramid at the heart of Tenochtitlan, was in fact two temples in one, the left shrine for Tlaloc, the right shrine for Huitzilopochtli, side by side on the same platform, their demands running in parallel like two tributary streams feeding the same river. In 1487, the ruler Ahuitzotl, Motekuctzoma's predecessor, the 8th Huey Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, dedicated the expanded and renovated Templo Maya with a ceremony that is one of the most documented and most debated events in Aztec history. The accounts that survive, from both indigenous and Spanish sources, describe a sacrifice of captives that lasted over several days, with the scale being the point of the event, a demonstration to the gods and to subject peoples and to allied rulers and to rivals of the Mexica's power and their ability to deliver on their cosmic obligations. The number most often cited in later accounts, 80,000 captives sacrificed in 4 days, is almost certainly a vast exaggeration, generated partly by Aztec propaganda designed to project power and partly by later Spanish sources eager to emphasize the civilization's brutality as a justification for its destruction. Modern scholars who have studied the logistics, the physical capacity of the site, and the demographic realities of the region treat the figure as symbolic excess rather than accurate count. What is not in dispute is that the rededication was real, that human sacrifice was central to it, and that its scale was deliberately intended to be overwhelming. The number matters less than what it meant. The Huey Tlatoani paying the next Lahuali on the grandest possible scale, publicly, in view of as much of the world as could be assembled to witness it. But the emperor's debt did not only require the blood of captured warriors, it required his own. Auto-sacrifice, the ritual offering of one's own blood, was practiced throughout the Aztec world, but its intensity scaled upward through the hierarchy the same way tribute obligations scaled. A commoner might pierce his earlobes or his tongue on a ritual occasion. A noble bled more frequently, and on more occasions. The priesthood bled regularly, sometimes dramatically, as part of the daily maintenance of the temples and the cosmic account. And the Huey Tlatoani, the man no one could look at, the man who changed his clothing multiple times a day and never wore a garment twice, the man who sat at the apex of the largest city in the Americas. He bled himself with maguey thorns and with obsidian blades. He pierced his earlobes, his tongue, the flesh of his thighs and calves and arms, and offered that blood to the gods who had made the world, and expected payment. The higher you stood, the more the debt cost you personally. It was the same logic that demanded a noble's execution for public drunkenness where a commoner might survive with a beating. The chain of obligation ran all the way to the top, and at the top it did not stop. It turned upward into the sky toward the gods who were the only creditors left. And so here we are at the end of the long descent. We have moved through every rung of this extraordinary world. The Makehuali farmer waking before dawn to tend his Calpulli plot, eating his nixtamalized maize tortillas and paying his tribute of labor and crop. The Tlacotin bond servant, not a chattel slave, but a person in a legal condition, owning property, capable of buying freedom, with children who would be born free. The Pochteca merchant, slipping back into the city at night with bales of Quetzal feathers and a head full of military intelligence about the road south. The Amanteca feather worker in a mantler, piecing together a mosaic that would cross an ocean and make a German artist in Nuremberg say he had never seen anything so beautiful. The warrior rising through a hierarchy measured in live captives, his costume announcing his rank to everyone who passed him in the street, hoping for the 4 prisoners that would make him a Quopili. The Pipiltin noble maintaining the appearance of virtue, his sumptuary clothing announced, knowing that the same rank that gave him cotton and jade labres would cost him his life for a transgression a farmer might survive. The Kalpixk arriving at a conquered town with his fan and his list. The merchant in the Tlatelolco market offering a handful of cacao beans for an avocado, and wondering whether the beans the seller gave back as change were real or filled with mud. None of them were free. This is the truth the obligation chain reveals, and it is not a comfortable truth, but it is a clarifying one. Freedom, in the modern sense of the autonomous individual making unconstrained choices, simply was not the organizing principle of this world. What organized this world was mutual indebtedness, a web so dense and so carefully maintained that it encompassed every person at every level, from the farmer who would forfeit his land if he left it untended for 2 years, to the emperor who spent his blood in the service of gods who had spent theirs to make the sun. This is, in its way, a kind of coherence, a logic complete enough to sustain a city of 250,000 people, one of the largest on Earth, in the middle of a lake in the highlands of central Mexico, fed by engineered floating gardens and supplied by tribute flowing from hundreds of subject provinces, served by a market that drew 60,000 traders every 5 days, maintained in a cleanliness that astonished visitors from cities that did not sweep their streets or collect their waste or pipe their fresh water across stone causeways. The obligation chain did not produce freedom, but it produced for a century something extraordinary. The Spanish soldiers who climbed the Templo Mayor in 1519 and looked out over Tenochtitlan wrote that they did not have words for it. Bernal Diaz, old and remembering, wrote that many of his companions said it seemed like things from an enchantment, the great towers and the pyramids rising from the water, and the orderly causeways, and the market with its roar, and the straight streets of the city spreading in every direction. He wrote that he did not know how to describe it because things which have never before been heard or seen or even dreamed of, he and his companions now stood watching with their own eyes. He was right that it was unlike anything they had seen, but it was not a dream. It was the product of 100 years of organized human effort, of tribute and debt and obligation and law, of farmers who knew exactly which 2 years would forfeit their land, and merchants who knew exactly which foreign disguise would get them home alive, and warriors who knew exactly how many captives separated them from the next rank of costume. It was one of the most organized places on earth, and if its organization ran on obligations that could be brutal and on a theology that demanded blood, it ran on them with a comprehensiveness and a consistency that most societies of the time, or for that matter most times, could not have matched. And now the city is quiet. The market at Tlatelolco has closed for the night. The traders have gone home across the causeways. The judges have left their court. The last cacao bean of the day has changed hands. The Templo Mayor stands against the dark sky, its twin shrines to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc dark at this hour, waiting for the morning rituals. The chinampas lie still on the lake, their willow roots holding the artificial earth in place against the slow current, ready for another harvest. Somewhere in the city, a feather worker in a mantler has set down his tools, and the iridescent mosaic he has been building from Quetzal feathers glows faintly in the last light. A warrior sleeps with a new hairstyle and the memory of his first captive. A noble removes his jade ear spools and his gold labrée and sets them beside him, taking off the signals of his rank for the hours when no one is watching. And the Huey Tlatoani, somewhere in his vast palace surrounded by his attendants, and his aviary and his 300 dishes, carries the debt he was born to carry. All of them paid, all of them were bound, and the extraordinary thing is not that this world eventually ended. Everything ends, every empire, every arrangement of obligation and power, but that it existed at all, that people built it, that they fed it and maintained it and added to it and made it complex enough that a Spanish soldier arriving from the far side of an ocean could not find the words. If you came here tonight wondering what your life would have been like at every level of this empire, if you wanted to feel the weight of the maguey fiber cloth against your skin and understand why the cotton on a noble's back was not just clothing, but law and money and rank and power all woven together, then I hope the descent was worth making. There are few places in history where the ordinary machinery of daily life is as precise, as documented, and as quietly astonishing as it is here, in the city, on the lake, in the world that the obligation chain built. The water is still tonight on what remains of the lake. The old city is mostly buried now beneath a newer one, beneath highways and plazas, and the foundations of cathedrals. But the Chinampa Gardens persist in places out toward the south, where the willow roots still hold the earth together the way they did when the city fed 250,000 people from islands it engineered from mud. They were here. They were extraordinary. And the world they made, with all its debts and all its obligations and all its terrible weight of duty, running from the farmer to the god-king to the gods themselves, is still worth knowing. If this kind of slow journey through a distant world helps you find your way towards sleep tonight, there are more slow stories here, of the same careful kind, waiting for whenever you want them. And if you feel moved to say where in the world you are listening from, I would genuinely like to know. The comments are there and I read them. You have done enough for one night. Set down whatever remains of the day. Nothing left to do now but be calm and drift.